those heartfelt words, I can say without a doubt that every person sitting in this room today has resonated with that message. I would now like to take this opportunity to welcome Gyalmo from the scenic highlands of Ladakh. Dignity, periods. Growing up, I was taught that these two words did not belong together. Well, today, I tell my story not because it is unique, but because it is not. It is the story of millions of girls. And yet, for the very first time when I spoke about my periods, I still felt like I was telling a secret. Well, I got my first period when I was in 5th grade and told no one, not even my mom, and especially not my father. I was taught to keep it away. I was taught it was shameful. It was the 3rd of December, Losar, our New Year festival. I checked, I looked down and saw red, sudden, and overwhelming. I had heard and even learned about menstruation, but not about the pain. I remember tearing last scraps of toilet paper, hoping that the blood wouldn't show. And I believed that. For years, I did exactly what I was told. I used to hide everything, be it pads, pain, or even my growing chest. It's genuinely painful to admit that every prayer was the same. God, please make me a boy. I grew up in Ladakh, in the Indian Himalayas, where faith is woven in daily life. We light our butter lamps at dawn and remove our shoes without being told. We bow before entering to the temples. Traditions was just something to be followed and never to be questioned. I followed the traditions until one left me deeply shaken. At a visit to a temple, I'd always longed to say, I was barred from entering. The reason? Menstruation, a natural life-enabling process, was considered impure. That the blood would somehow make the sacred space dirty or disturbs the energy of the deity. Some people teach the women should stay at home, or they do not have to go to the temple so they won't pollute the god. But when I heard that, I was left questioning, how could something so essential makes me less worthy? I stood at the threshold, barefoot, the incense drifting past me, watching others step inside. It wasn't just about the access to a temple. It was about my worth, my dignity. Until that moment, I had believed that rules were neutral, sacred, and untouchable. If I was excluded, I assumed that my body was a problem. But standing there, my perspective changed. I began to see that rules were not protecting the holiness. It was just protecting the hierarchy. And for the first time, I stopped asking, what is wrong with me? And started asking, who decided that this was wrong? That day, I realized that I had been taught to protect the traditions, but not my own dignity. That day, I didn't just question, but I promised myself that I would change the silence. 2 years later, in 7th grade, I kept the promise by founding a student-led organization to break the menstrual taboo in rural Ladakh. I stayed up late at night, practicing how to say periods out loud and trying to find the right words for something no one really spoke about openly. At first, I thought change meant workshops, plays, posters, doing things you could measure and count. But honestly, somewhere along the way, I realized that change also meant sitting with a mother who had never spoken to her daughter about periods and hearing her say that I never knew where to start from. In a tiny village of Kargil, we met a woman. She told us that the garbage trucks had refused to collect the used pads. So she burned them in the fields or hid them in scraps of cloth or carried them miles just to throw them away. That was when my perspective changed. I realized that talking alone was not enough. I connected with initiatives making biodegradable pads and from banana fiber and bamboo. And I began launching awareness programs in tribal and nomadic areas. And I asked the question, what is the opportunity cost of this silence? Imagine not being able to attend the school simply because you don't have access to a pad, a private toilet, or even the dignity and freedom to talk about your own body. In one of the schools that I visited in Chamthang, a girl once told me that she had to miss 4 days of school every month. I asked her why. She did not say that I don't have pads. She said, I'd say it feels safer to stay at home. Safer. Safer from the stares, from the jokes from the silence. Safer from the world that treats her body as something to hide and not something to carry with dignity. Across India today, many young people are beginning to change this silence, often echoing the slogan, "Hum bolenge, muh kholenge, tabhi zamana badlega," which translates to, only when we speak will the world change. But I began to wonder that how could change begin when silence is the first thing we are taught? It is shocking to learn that in India, many girls have no knowledge of menstruation before they get their first periods. The real cost of menstrual shame is not the blood. It is the lost opportunities. When something as natural as menstruation can decide who enters a temple, who enters a classroom, or who feels worthy, we are no longer talking about an individual choice. We are talking about the whole structure. Because when silence is taught early enough, it stops becoming personal. It becomes structural. Dignity is not something we give to girls after they suffer. It's something we build into the systems that they grow up in. When I had the opportunity to ask His Holiness the Dalai Lama a question, I asked what had always haunted me. Why are women barred from the temples? His response became my compass. He said, compassion does not discriminate, and enlightenment has no gender. That was the first time when I understood my faith differently. I realized that if enlightenment has no gender, then dignity cannot have one either. The very traditions I thought had excluded me suddenly seemed capable of holding the equality. Inspired by his words, I returned to the same temple, but this time with my younger younger sister. At first, they hesitated. The rule was still there. But this time, I asked why. We spoke, we waited. The rules did not change overnight. But what did change was the perspective of the person in charge, the priest. The one who had always said no, without even thinking. For the first time, he had to pause and consider whether these rules still made sense. And in that moment, his hesitation became a small crack in the wall of silence. And eventually, they let us in. My sister and I walked through the temple doors I was once locked out of. And now I made sure that she did it with comfort and dignity. And now I live by, if not me, then who? And if not now, then when? I used to think that it was a cruel irony that my first period came on low side. The most awaited day of the whole year was when I felt the most vulnerable. But perhaps that day was not ironic. Perhaps that day gave me purpose. Talking about periods with anyone felt dangerous, especially with my father. In our house, silence was respect, and mentioning my body felt like I was breaking a rule I couldn't even name. For years, I carried the fear like another period camp. Quiet, constant, and exhausting. But silence becomes harder to hold when you start questioning it. I started speaking about periods in public long before I could even talk about it freely at home. The irony is that the way I work to break silence in my community, the more I realized how deeply it lived inside my own home. That day, I finally discussed about periods with my father. I expected discomfort. I expected him to just look away. But instead, we had a nice conversation. He did not change the subject. He did not lower his voice. He simply said, "Ye como," which translates to "my daughter," and patted my head. And slowly, something shifted. He began to speak more openly about periods, not just with me, but with others. When relatives made jokes about women's problem, ha ha ha, he didn't laugh anymore. Now, when people tell him, "Mr. Jigdal, your daughters are as good as sons," he simply smiles and says, "They don't have to be sons. They are my daughters, my strength." That is when I realized my father's silence was not protection. It was just a habit, and habits, like rituals, can change. And in that moment, I realized something important. Sometimes, change does not begin with policies or rules. Sometimes, it begins with perspectives. My father's perspective had changed. And when perspective changes, relationships change, conversations change, and possibilities do change. And I no longer wish to be a boy. I am my father's daughter, and that is enough. From toilet paper to temple doors, I carried shame. And now I carry dignity of my own, of my sisters, and of that of the girls who once hid in silence.